Badminton Comedy by Zulu Elitspa. A cluster of plump fleas milled about on the gray muzzle of the tiger's chin, unconcerned that they were mere inches from the mouth of one of the planet's mightiest predators. At random intervals, the bridge of the tiger's nose creased with irritation, a trembling two-stroke pulse, which raised with it the corner of his black lips, exposing his dulled teeth. His gums were as pale as the withered grass which lined his pen. Fitful wheezes periodically interrupted the rise and fall of his emaciated ribs beneath the tawny carpet of his fur, which had been drained of vitality by years of captivity. The smoke from the wildfires, up in the hills, had fallen low enough to catch the full light of the orange sunbeams which pierced the barrier of sun-faded tiki leaves, decorating the chicken wire fencing of the narrow exhibition. It was uncommonly hot, even for carnival season. "I know what you're thinking," said Colonel Winston, his thin breath whistling in the afternoon heat. "It's animal cruelty to keep a cat like that locked up, isn't it?" I could practically see him behind me, straining the parched canvas of his cocky drill suit. The wooden beams of his folding director's chair creaked, despite the man's placid stillness. I had to assume he knew his chair better than I did, but all the same, it was making me nervous. I took a step back from the tiger cage, looking over my shoulder to make sure I didn't bump against the sunburnt flesh of his exposed knee. "Here's the thing, though," said the colonel, before his speech dissolved into a series of gurgles. He pushed his gut as deeply into his knees as he could, wriggling behind himself with one arm as he braced his torso against the chair with the other, reaching for something in his back pocket. I doubt that I was sweating any less than he was, but there was just so much more of him from which to sweat. The streams had all merged into one slick layer of sheen on his ruddy face, and then wicked off his double chin and splashed against the already drenched front of his field shirt. And I have always wondered, how is it that people do not notice when there is an enormous purple vein bulging out from the thin skin of their temple? Do they not feel the thumping? He had been fishing for a flask, and had apparently now caught it. He settled back against his chair, took a few deep breaths, and muttered, "There we go," as the brick red of his face began to fade into a healthier color. He unscrewed the lid and took a long pull. "There we go," he muttered again, punctuating it this time with a hiccup. "As I was saying, you're probably wondering how a scrawny little half-pint like myself could take on a beast like that." I turned my mouth towards the colonel, making sure he could tell that I was still more interested in Churchill, as the tiger was apparently named, than whatever he was getting ready to say. "Actually," I said, "you were saying that his cage was too small." He took a quick breath and made a sudden exclamation. "The point I was trying to make was this." The edge of the tiger's pen was framed with photographs of his victims. Rib cages torn open, limbs ripped from sockets, faces chewed and shredded. Churchill the man-killer, dread specter of the silken jungle nights. "If he was really so unhappy in there, he'd rip through that fencing in a second. Not like he hadn't done it before. The army'd have him trapped twice, titanium alloys and all that. And all the same, he slipped out and went on killing. At the same time, it seemed like there wasn't a bushwhacker in Burma who hadn't shot him once or twice either. You'd think you were lying if you hadn't done it yourself every now and then. Back then, I could stand a month or two in a bush. Nowadays..." Something behind me caught the colonel's attention. I turned around to see a young boy's head peering over the sun-faded tiki grass barricade as the colonel lowered his chair behind me with a thud. "If you want to see the bloody tiger," roared the colonel, "then you'll pay the goddamn fee!" The kid ran off without a sound, and the colonel once again unscrewed his flask. He took a long pull, and then wiped his mouth. "Fucking kids," he said. "Can't make a living with these damn kids running around, sneaking about, telling everyone the tiger's half dead. Hard enough with the internet already. Just hop on the Google and you can see 1,000 tigers. Hell, you can even find videos of tigers killing people and all sorts of girls doing all sorts of..." He stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Anyway, where was I?" "You were telling me about how you captured the tiger." Right. Bloody hell it was. You can't shoot the things anymore and you need a license to buy the tranquilizers. Of course, when I first started out, it was the opposite problem. So many tigers, it seemed like every Tom, Dick, and Harry had a hunting business going. Most of them weren't worth a damn, of course. Just ignorant bird watchers looking for a quick buck. I'm pretty sure that's how Churchill here got his taste for murder. Queer thing, he never seemed to actually eat his victims. Speaking of which," he lowered his voice and leaned forward, "how'd you like to see this bloody bastard go 3 rounds with a hobo?" Churchill awakened at the word hobo and turned to stare at me as he licked his lips with a sense of grim anticipation. "Is that legal?" "No," said the colonel, with a wink. "I think I'll pass." He shrugged. All right. I'll admit it's not for everyone. I don't like it much myself, to be honest, but there ain't too many people willing to pay just to look at the beast. They want to see it in action. Plus, it's good for him to get a bit of exercise. Anyway, if you change your mind, come back around sundown with $20. He took another swig from his flask and then began speaking to someone else. "Paying customers, are you?" he asked. 2 young people, apparently a couple, stepped aside to let me out, and I wandered back onto the dismal midway of what a road sign said had triumphantly declared to be the world's smallest carnival. So far I'd already seen the much-lauded history's oldest clown, and true to the advertisement, there was not much else to claim my attention. There were posters for a fortune-teller and a cramped arcade promising fabulous prizes, sure, but the fortune-teller's booth had closed early due to unforeseen circumstances, and I did not want to take anything from this place home with me. Then I saw the final sign. It was at the far end of the squalid row of tents that comprised the midway. A hand-painted depiction of a shuttlecock over some text reading, "Comedy of Badminton." At the end of the narrow alleyway, past the crumpled carnival programs and discarded bags of stale popcorn, stood a rotund little man, sweating through his swallowtail tuxedo, just outside the open flap of a heavy canvas tent. When the man saw me approach, he furrowed his brow and cupped his hands to his mouth to call out to me in a thick German accent, "Have you come to see the show?" I was already walking over. "What's it about exactly?" "Can you not read?" he asked, gesturing toward the sign. "It is badminton comedy, a performance of badminton with comedic elements. Do you want to see the show or not? We are almost sold out." I shrugged and handed him the money. He produced a ticket from his pocket and gave it to me with a nod. I stepped around him, eager for the shade of the tent. But then the German called out to me, "What the hell are you doing? Wait in line until the usher can take your ticket." He was pointing at a patch of empty ground on the other side of the doorway. I took my place at the front of the line. We stood there for a while, the German staring impatiently towards the midway, his bald head shining with sweat. Eventually, the young couple emerged from the tiger exhibit and made their way towards us. The lady was giggling, and as they got closer, I could hear the young man putting on a thick English accent. "And then I wrestled the bloody bastard to the ground, bare-handed, by Jove. Shot him up with a bit of my finest China white, I did, and he's been tame ever since. God save the Queen! Where'd I put my flask? Hey, you bloody tyke, gotta pay the fee to watch the kitty take a nap. He stopped short when the German called out to him, with an accusing finger raised high. You there, you fancy yourself a performer? Perhaps you'd like an exhibition from a professional. The man looked at the lady. He said with a shrug. Why not? They got their tickets and the German shouted at them to get in line. I raised my hand and smiled sheepishly as the two of them meandered over to stand behind me. A few moments later, the German pulled out his watch to check the time, and then turned to address us. The usher will be with you shortly. He disappeared inside the tent and then came back out. I am the usher, he announced. Do you have your tickets? I couldn't help but chuckle as I pulled mine out and handed it over. As I made my way inside, I heard the German snap at the young man. Do not play games with me. Do you have your ticket or not? The young man grumbled something, and then a moment later, the two of them darkened the door behind me, still giggling to each other as the German continued to shout at them. Save your jokes for the feeble-minded drudge hanging off your arm. You are in the presence of a master. The inside of the tent, although very dark, was much hotter than the outside. There was a net in the middle and 2 rows of wooden benches beside the door. The closest thing to decoration was a feeble old woman swatting, half-heartedly, at a cloud of flies buzzing around her ear at the far end of the second bench. In the front row sat a father and his young son, perhaps 9 years old. I recognized him as the boy who had been sneaking a glimpse at the tiger. The young couple were the only other patrons to come after me. I made my way to the back row and sat down on the cracked wooden bench. I could hear the boy whining to his dad. How much longer? I don't know, said the man. But we're going to leave after this. You can wait a little longer. Achtung! Screamed the German from the doorway. The show will now begin! He pulled a rope, and the canvas door flap dropped with a heavy thud. And it took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, even further, to the now richer darkness of the tent. I heard him fumbling with something, and then he made his way to the front of the bleachers with a blowhorn in hand. In order to avoid unnecessary distractions, it is requested that you shut off your cellular phones at once. He barked through the blowhorn. It is also advised that any beeping watches be disabled at this moment. Please understand that the performance cannot tolerate disruptions, and there will be no refunds if you spoil it for yourself. I couldn't tell if he was serious or not, but he was definitely funny. I laughed, and he marched over to scream at me through the blowhorn. Please hold all laughter until the end of the show. I winced at the volume of his shouting, and the young man in the front row whispered to his girlfriend. What the fuck? The German cleared his throat and lowered the blowhorn to continue in a regular speaking voice. The show will begin when every phone has been silenced. We dutifully complied with his instructions. After all phones had been silenced, he turned around and shouted at the back of the tent. Heinrich! Klaus! 2 lean young men sprung out from behind the canvas partition at the back of the darkened tent with rackets in hand and jogged over to stand on opposite sides of the net. The German turned back to us and gestured vaguely in their direction, raising the blowhorn once again to introduce his performers. Heinrich? Klaus? Heinrich and Klaus were dressed in what appeared to be retro collegiate tennis uniforms. Starched white tank tops and black cotton shorts with canvas tennis shoes. Their faces, their lean physiques, everything except the length of their hair, was identical. Heinrich, or Klaus, wore his hair somewhat long, and Klaus, or Heinrich, kept his neatly trimmed. They nodded to us as they were introduced, and then turned to face each other. Satisfied that the performers were in place, the German raised the blowhorn once again. The Comedy of Badminton, he said, utilizes a distinct and obscure form of humor to provoke the desired reaction. It is known as Grim Existentialism, born in the death camps of Krakow and refined on the killing fields of Rhodesia. This form of comedy seeks to tear down the artificial veil of reality and replace it with a much purer understanding of our place in the world. for better or for worse. It is our sincere hope that this performance will prove to be very challenging, and you will walk away with some glimmer of insight into your true humanity." The German paused to catch his breath, and again I heard the young man whisper to the woman, "What the fuck?" Our presenter glared at him, and then reached into his pocket. He produced a shuttlecock, and tossed it over his shoulder. The long-haired performer intercepted it with his racket, and stood dribbling in the shadows. Finally, the German turned around and barked an order through his blowhorn. "Begin!" With a flick of his wrist, the long-haired performer sent the shuttlecock flying over the net. The other returned his serve, and the two of them stood passing it back and forth a few times before they began to move closer, still passing the shuttlecock over the net, until they were no more than a foot apart. "Observe," said the German, "the lack of distance between the players. In a game of speed and skill, it is absurd for two players to devote their concentration to such a narrow field of play. The humor in such a display lay plain for all to see." The father in front of me groaned. The German barked out another order, and the two performers spread apart, still passing the shuttlecock back and forth with expert precision. The German turned back to address us. "At this point in the performance, it is customary to reverse the previous maneuver. We would like to hit the shuttlecock as high in the air as possible, but the low ceiling of the tents prevents such a display. But you can easily imagine what it would look like, and therefore gain an understanding of the humor involved. It would be absurd to rely on raw strength in a game which is defined by expert manipulation of low-weight projectiles." The young man turned to his girlfriend. "This isn't funny." The German glared at him once again, and then turned to Heinrich and Klaus. "Over the back!" he barked. Heinrich and Klaus turned their backs on each other, and continued to pass the shuttlecock without a moment of delay. "Now witness," said the German, "this absurd method of gameplay. To turn your back on your opponent is folly, not to mention the obvious physical difficulties such a position presents." The sweat was beading on my brow. I reached up to wipe it away and then heard the boy speak to his dad. "I want to leave." The dad shrugged. "You heard the man. No refunds. I'm sure it'll be over soon. They can't keep going in this heat." I looked over to Heinrich and Klaus. Neither of them were sweating. Their breath was even and calm. The German shouted out again, "Under the legs!" The two players turned around to face each other, and each hooked an arm under their legs. They continued passing the shuttlecock as the German turned back to us. "This maneuver offers no commentary on the philosophical implications of badminton. It is purely humor for the sake of humor." The young man shouted back, "No, it isn't." "Silence!" barked the German, "or I will have your testicles!" The young man sighed and reached up to run his hands through his hair, and then shake the sweat from his palms. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the elderly lady stand up and begin to make her way down the aisle. Klaus and Heinrich stopped immediately, one of them deftly catching the shuttlecock before they both snapped to attention, rackets at their sides. "The performance will continue when everyone has returned to their seats," said the German. The elderly woman stopped and turned to him. "I need to use the restroom." The German scoffed. "Number 1 or number 2? She paused, not sure how to answer. "You can hold it, or you can live as a slave to your bladder. It is your choice, but let me warn you now. We will be here all night if we must stop the show for every biological urge which possesses the audience." The father groaned, either in sympathy or irritation. The young man shook his head and wiped his face with his shirt, while his girlfriend tried to fan herself with her hand. I billowed my shirt and focused on my breathing. The old lady returned to her seat and sat whimpering as the German shouted for the performance to continue. Heinrich and Klaus continued passing the shuttlecock back and forth for a few seconds before the German let out a long, slow whistle. The two players suddenly broke free from the performance and engaged in an all-out competition, each one slamming the shuttlecock with all of their might, and neither one missing a return. The game moved so fast, the players with such precision, that it was almost impossible to follow. I didn't even notice the Alsatian dog on the court, until it shrieked with pain as Heinrich or Klaus accidentally stumbled over it. "This is a very complicated joke," said the German, as the dog limped off towards the canvas partition. "Not only is it highly improper for a dog to be on a badminton court, this is considered downright cruel for a person to take pleasure from the sight of an injured animal. Do not worry, I can assure you that the kick was only a feint. The dog has been trained to yelp on command and has received no injury." "Darn," spat the young man. "I paid good money to see a dog get kicked." "And you may very well yet," said the German, with narrowed eyes, "if you do not put a leash on your mouth." The young man had nothing to say. No one had anything to say about anything. The routine continued through a dozen tricks, but I can only remember a few more after that. Eyes closed, no rackets, double rackets. The routine went on until my head was spinning. But I can remember in vivid detail the moment it occurred to me that the sun must have fallen long ago. And when this realization snapped me back into lucidity, the German was ranting and raving, as Heinrich and Klaus passed the shuttlecock back and forth, with glasses of water balanced on their heads. "We are poorer than our ancestors, who at least had memories of discipline and honor, two virtues long forgotten in these days. For who among us can say that he has truly lived? Who among us can say that he has ever truly killed? Some people say that we need to restore virtue to civic life, that we need to restore our past of church and country. But this talk of restoration and recovery is misguided and idealistic. There is nothing left to recover, nothing to restore. Our parents could perhaps remember, but they sacrificed the chance to restore our past in exchange for cheap comforts, and now those memories have withered on the vine. You cannot recover what you have never had, and this generation has never had virtue, never known the glory of sacrifice. They are coddled, they are weak. But there is an answer. Badminton demands sacrifice and discipline, but it also demands focus. It demands finesse. But do not, my friends, be intimidated by the nobility of badminton. It is not some art or science, some imperious mountaintop which only the precious few are permitted to scale. Badminton can be played almost anywhere, by anyone. All you need is... "I've had enough!" shrieked the young man. The show stopped immediately as he jumped to his feet, fists balled at his side. "Enough of what?" asked the German, his head cocked to the side. "You know goddamn well what I'm talking about," said the young man. "I'm tired of watching this shit. This is a total rip-off. I want my money back." The German shrugged. "You can leave any time you want, but a refund is quite impossible. I already told you that." The young man snorted. "You want to bet? Listen, pal, I can make your life a living hell. I've got over 100,000 followers on..." I don't think even he realized he was storming towards the German, who brought his tirade to a halt with a single sharp whistle. The Alsatian came running from the canvas partition at the back of the tent, snapping and snarling, and the young man stood dumbfounded as the dog leapt up and seized him by the throat. "Stay in your seats," said the German, although none of us had moved an inch. "With a single word, the dog will deliver the killing stroke, and it will be self-defense, for you all saw that the man was going to attack me. If the gentleman will not leave without his refund, then he may watch the remainder of the show from the ground." The young man's girlfriend regained her senses and jumped up to help her boyfriend, in spite of the German's warning. The father just barely managed to catch her arm. She looked at her boyfriend for a moment and then sank back onto the bench. In resignation, the young man was whimpering and clutching at his throat, held in place by the dog. To the left of me, I heard the elderly woman moan as a stream of urine began to drip onto the dry ground. The show resumed. It went on for another 10 minutes or so, but now the audience was transfixed by the blood trickling from the young man's throat. The father stood up and beckoned to his son. "We're out of here." The German shouted out to him. "If you want to leave, this is your decision, but that is not a choice you can make for someone else.
If the boy wants to stay, then he can stay."
The father scoffed and looked down at his son, who was still staring at the young man in stark-eyed fear, unaware of anything else taking place in the tent. Then he turned to the German. "What the hell are you talking about?" said the man. "This is my son. I paid for both." His hands flew to his neck as he dropped to his knees, coughing and choking. He turned around to look at me, his eyes bulging. Through the spittle forming around his mouth, I could see the red plastic feathers of a badminton shuttlecock sticking out from the back of his throat. I looked up to see Klaus, or Heinrich, watching the scene impassively, at parade rest as Heinrich or Klaus spun his racket in a lazy arc. I made my way over the bench in the front, aware of the eyes of all three performers, following me with keen interest, and reached down to the man's throat. With a sharp tug, I pulled the shuttlecock free, and the man fell back with one arm sprawled across the front bench, gasping and wheezing. I tossed the shuttlecock over to Klaus or Heinrich, who batted it back at the father. "He can keep it. It is a souvenir," said the German, "of his own arrogance." He looked down at the boy. Klaus, or Heinrich, followed the German's focus with rapt attention, shuttlecock in hand. The German barked at the boy. "Are you going to stay?" I could think of no way to help the boy. There was, technically, the option to leave without a refund. But who knew what technicality the German would invent to prohibit any departure, what punishment he would devise for trying. And who was left to try but me? The other option was to somehow stop the show, to invent for ourselves some method to subvert or interrupt the performance. That would involve outwitting all three men, none of whom had shown the slightest sign of delinquency in their command of the situation. I would have one chance, and one chance only, to experiment with this possibility. How many years had they been doing this? How many examples of defiance had they encountered and overcome? Perhaps we might have been able to contact the authorities. And in fact, several times I imagined grabbing my phone, waiting for it to power on, and then dialing 3 numbers, and there would need to be a distraction. Someone to protect me from the cunning of the German and his performers. The old lady? Staring dead ahead, either in exhaustion or shame. The woman, held as tightly by the dog's grip as her boyfriend. The father? Eyes fixed starkly upon the German in fear. The boy. He had already failed once. There was no way to get their attention, let alone come to any unspoken agreement, that one of us should make the call as the other somehow distracted all 3 of the men on the court. United in goal, but fractured in method. Who could we trust now but ourselves? Despite our numbers, we would be forced to wait out the performance individually. I was only stopped from weeping by a sudden miracle, for once again the German had paused the show. "Are you going to use your phone, or simply stare at it?" He was looking at me. I didn't know what to say. "I won't stop you. Call the police. Tell them you are being held hostage by a foreign man who wishes for you to watch a tedious performance. Describe to them how a man was nearly killed with a shuttlecock. I hope you memorized the address of this carnival. The SWAT team will certainly want to know. I'll give you a hint. It's at least 1 hour from the nearest police station." The performance resumed. It seemed like Klaus and Heinrich were taking a break, rackets behind their back as they stood at parade rest. Or maybe this trick was really just nothing. "Life is made of time," said the German. "This is no metaphor. Even now we all shuffle closer to the grave. You there." The defiant arrow of his finger aimed over my shoulder, towards some absent observer. You are now older than you have been before, shunting yourself not second by second in any measurable spastic halting, for decay need not rest, does not for a moment slacken in its momentum. And without slack there can be no surge. Does your heart click as it pumps? No, rather, you are sliding smoothly down the hill of time, towards the yawning mouth of oblivion. Still, you are not yet a spring chicken in my eyes, who was born amidst the piercing silence of the armistice, came of age in the daunting lack of spirit that haunted the interregnum, him who was ripe enough already to understand that der Führer was nothing more than an idle loafer. You think you understand frustration because you were tricked out of a few hours? The strain of this performance threatens to make my heart burst at any moment, and yet I persist, merely to prove a point. Remember now that you have already paid, and that there can be no refund. Listen now as I count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The price of admission is only a fraction of the cost. 1, 2, 3. Even if by some miracle something should intervene to stop me, what difference would it make now? 1, 2. The Alsatian began to whimper, backing away from the young man, tail whisking the ground like a broom as it whined, absent-mindedly bumping into Klaus and Heinrich. As it noticed the two young men, it curled itself into their legs, apparently trying to hide. Outside, a bumbling pair of feet, carrying an unbalanced load, thumped against the ground, bounced once against the canvas, and then slowly slid along, sometimes rolling, until it arrived at the flap and pulled it aside, revealing that night had in fact not yet fallen. It was merely a premature dusk, brought on by the smoke of the wildfires. Everyone turned to the doorway, against which Colonel Winston had thrown himself, flask in hand. "Run for your bloody lives!" screamed the colonel, pausing to take a long pull from his flask. "The damn tiger's gotten loose!" He took off at a trot down the alleyway, and then flopped down in the dirt. A second pair of footsteps, much lighter than the first, came paddling up to the flap. The tiger poked his head in, sniffing the air with curiosity, before suddenly honing in on the sharp tang of the young man's blood. The German turned to shout at his performers. "Klaus! Heinrich!" The two young men leapt forward, rackets in hand, leaving the Alsatian to flop onto its back, exposing with a broad grin its soft underbelly. The German pointed to the tiger. "Our patrons are in danger!" With a curt nod, Klaus and Heinrich squared up to the beast, trading terse commands with one another in German. The tiger met their gaze with a yawn, as the two performers spread apart and raised their rackets high. The young man began crawling towards the safety of the bleachers. The performers circled the tiger, drawing ever tighter, thrusting and swinging their rackets to draw the beast's attention. And then, with a fierce roar, the tiger charged past them to seize the elderly woman by the arm. The young man charged into battle, swatting at the cat as it shook its prey like a rag doll. The young woman took off, vaulting over her boyfriend without a second glance, the father carrying his son right behind her. The young man was now lying on the ground in shock, his eyes fluttering and his entire body limp. I looked behind me, where Heinrich or Klaus was tugging on the oblivious tiger's tail, while Klaus or Heinrich swatted at its head with his racket. And then to the German, who was smiling with pride at the entire scene. I slipped my arms under the young man's shoulders and began to drag him to the exit as his blood dripped down his back and onto my chest. I barely made it 2 steps before the Alsatian came bounding out to cut off my retreat with a fierce snarl, keeping one wary eye on the tiger. I dropped the young man and bolted. Outside, it became obvious that there was nowhere to run. A hot backdraft seared the landscape. dragging waves of smoke away from the horizon across the fairgrounds. Glowing cinders fluttered in the air, sinking down from the sky and then swirling back up from the sun-baked earth beneath the dry grass. The back of my neck was tickling with pinpricks of heat, which were extinguishing themselves on my skin just fast enough to save me the trouble of brushing them away. Down the midway, I could see that a panicked attempt to pack away the carnival had been abandoned, leaving half-erect tents flapping in the wind, finally flopping one by one in the bundles of rope and canvas against the ground. Blindly I stumbled until I was free of the maze of useless amusements, coughing and choking against the searing acrid heat. I squinted through the tears, searching in vain for a path back home, as the narrow bands of orange flame worked their way down the hillsides in every direction, leaving thick stripes of shadow amongst the blackened soil. Here and there, a tree on the horizon went up in a screaming starburst of embers. All around me, thin tendrils of smoke began to twist up from where the larger cinders had nestled amongst the grass. The last of the tangled canvas and poles now toppled over in the scorching wind, leaving only the sturdy beams of the badminton comedy tent unbothered. There were voices behind me, or rather, one voice. "I don't know." The father, who had taken a position as the leader of his son and the young woman, now stood shrugging, unable to remember which direction he had taken to get there, unsure of what he would do if he did. There were no landmarks by which to chart a course, only a roiling field of smoky columns. Even the barely open flap of the badminton tent, a thin black mouth in the thick gray air, was beginning to grow dimmer. He led them back, feeling with one hand against the canvas, nearly tripping over Colonel Winston's drunken form. Like little black dots, they huddled against the sickly comfort of the tent, asking themselves how much longer they could bear to stand outside. From their position, they could not yet see the thick haze of smoke rising from the roof, where the cinders were becoming embers amidst the hot wind. Just then I noticed the rickety, wizened figure wearing a jester's outfit. He was leaning against Colonel Winston, but I could not tell if he was using him for support or trying to rouse him. I had to admit, it was kind of funny.